So I'm like, as long as I keep myself to that, let's do 50 of those and then take it from there. And then we got our first yes, I think at the 17th no.
This is Funded, a show where founders who raised millions in venture capital share the gritty side of what it actually took to get that money in the bank. I'm Jason Ye. Not too long ago, I was trying to get my ideas funded. And back in the day, I was a VC listening to founders pitch me for money. Regulated neurotechnology for women's hormonal health. It's a compelling category to pitch investors today. But back when Dr. Emilė Radytė was first knocking on doors in 2021, before women's health was even a recognized investment category, it wasn't the easy sell you might imagine. Despite being a deeply credentialed and technical founder with degrees from Harvard and Oxford, Dr. Radytė ran into the same wall so many great founders do early on. Investors couldn't pattern match. Hardware and regulation in the same deal made most VCs nervous. And convincing people to back a category that barely existed was harder than her clinical data alone could fix. Fast forward to today, and Samphire Neuro has regulatory clearance in Europe and the UK, a successful US launch, and a $5 million seed round that came in oversubscribed. Led by, funny enough, an investor who cold messaged her on LinkedIn and flew out the next day to earn their spot. The path there was filled with moments that remind us just how hard fundraising can be, even when the science is undeniable and the demand is real. Emilė surprised me with a lot of what she shared. But before we get there, I had to find out what she was like long before she ever thought about raising a single dollar.
I think most people would have described me as a little bit of an obsessive kid. So I would get into things and then, kind of get into them and they would be my whole thing for a month and then move on from them. So a couple of examples were like, for a time, I really got into like botany and decided that I needed to memorize every functional plant out there and everything because I had found a book or something like that. And then it would be very in depth for like the cosmos or something like that. So I would have a couple of these spikes. I think very early on, I also liked and was a little bit entrepreneurial as well. So liked coming up with new ideas and testing them out in the wild. Still to this day, I remember so much how me and a couple of friends had some of those fireworks before Christmas that are just like on a stick. Sprinkler or sparklers?
Sparklers, I think, yeah.
I think sparklers. Yeah. And so we removed the bit that burns and you keep the metal rod. And I realized that if you twisted that metal rod, you could make earrings for people if you added some beads, which is obviously not at all sanitary and not great for people. And at the time, I didn't even have my ears pierced, but I'm like, that's innovation. And then we made a bunch of like kind of earrings and saw whether they would make it something into the community. So I think, yeah, as a kid, I was always like kind of tinkering with things, both physical and wanted to do things with other people. And all
Is that because of any sort of model that you had in your life? Were your parents obsessive entrepreneurs? You have multiple degrees now. Were they academics? Like where were your
Yeah,
models?
it's interesting. Things make a lot more sense when you look backwards. At the time, I couldn't think I was more different from my parents. But yeah, my dad's an engineer. Actually, both of my parents are engineers. And my dad is also a serial entrepreneur. So he's done a lot of businesses in a lot of different spaces as well, but always kind of exploring, and all of them were kind of R&D based. So definitely came from that side of the family, but it never felt that way. As a kid, you don't necessarily see that side. But yeah, so they're both engineers. They're both from Lithuania originally, which is where I was born and raised. And I was in Lithuania until I was 18 and left for college. And so Lithuania, for those who might not know, was part of the Soviet Union. And so obviously my parents had grown up under the communistic bit. So a lot of the ways of doing business and operating was very different. And also the role of women was quite different. So a lot of women were engineers actually in the Soviet Union as well. So I kind of had a little bit of that heritage, even though I was already born in independent Lithuania, to kind of bring with me and inform a lot of the way I think I view innovation, access, and kind of scalability now as well.
Yeah, I'm curious because my parents are also engineers, scientists, immigrants into the States.
Mm.
I'm just curious, what was the push from them? Their push, was it get the most advanced degrees that you can and then we'll see where it lands? Or were they like, you can be anything you want to be, and you can start businesses? Like, do you remember that push from when you were little?
Yeah, I think the push was always to be the best version of myself. Like it was a very high support environment in the sense that I could always rely on them, but it was always a high expectation thing. And it was kind of like, as long as you could keep pushing, you should. There wasn't such a thing as not pushing, but it was never necessarily in a particular direction. I just happened to also have those interests as well. But I think reflecting upon it, it was always that if you are able to do something, you should be doing that thing and pushing yourself to be that best version.
Nice. And so early on, you had the idea of taking essentially scrap metal to building your own jewelry empire. But if we're realistic about it, what did you think you wanted to be, or where did you see your career going? Not just like as a 5, 10-year-old, but as you started going to college, where did you think that path was going to take you?
Frankly, I think I really struggled with it because I felt that the job environment was changing so much and none of the jobs that I was seeing felt like they felt exactly right for me. So at the time, people like myself who were relatively academic, interested in science, should have gone to either the engineering or medicine if they were leading a little bit biologically, just because they're like that was the kind of the only thing you were aware of. And Lithuania, by the way, for context, is a very educated community in the sense that 70% of people have an undergrad degree, which sounds insane, but it's because the government pays for it. So it's
Man,
kind of the expectation that you just go to college. So yeah, so like those were the options. And it didn't necessarily feel right for me because I didn't have doctors in my family and things like that. So I didn't know what the reality as a clinician would be. And at the same time, I felt that something could be missing. And I also felt that the world was changing so much that the professions of the future would be something that wasn't done yet. And even as a teenager, that actually left me quite frustrated because I felt that how can I train for a job I can't even see anyone else doing? And
yeah.
in fact, that was one of the reasons why I applied to go to the States. And I'm so grateful that I got a full ride for Harvard as well. But the US is based on a kind of liberal arts education. So you don't need to pick what you're going to study there. And I think for a person like myself, who otherwise would have been just gone to medicine and gone the straight path, that was really enabling. And I'll forever be grateful for having had that opportunity.
But what did you end up deciding to study coming to Harvard for your undergrad?
Yeah, so I ended up doing a joint degree in neuroscience and anthropology. So that was essentially a combination of studying the brain and then hopefully how it's contextualized with the people around us.
And at that point, still like early on, was it just following what you were interested in? Where did you think that would go? Like you just said that you didn't necessarily want to be a scientist, but you were studying science. So did you have ideas? Not that you needed to, but I'd be curious.
Yeah, I came in and I told myself that for the first year, just because I got this opportunity, I'm going to mess around and literally just sign up for classes I love and just do that for a year and then reflect upon my choices. And then for the first year, what was very fascinating is all of the classes I signed up for were either psychology, biology, physics, kind of going into those fields, but a lot of them happened to be very brain focused. And in fact, even my first semester, I took a study on kind of at the time psychedelic medicine. So, kind of the future of where medicine would be going, especially in psychiatry and things like that. So, kind of loved studying the brain from the get go. And then in my second semester, I actually trained all semester alongside classes. I trained to become an emergency medic, so like an EMT. So, being very much on the ground and seeing what applied kind of science looked like. And then would end up working in emergency medicine for the rest of my kind of time in the US as well. But yeah, so I think that was the bit of it and how I discovered it, allowing myself to explore a little bit and then
Yeah.
realizing at the end of the year that I had done a lot of the requirements for the neuroscience degree already.
Nice. Okay. So uh it doesn't seem like entrepreneurship or even or in particular like venture back entrepreneurship is even on the radar at this point because looking at your resume, you didn't feel like you were accomplished enough at Harvard and you ended up going for advanced degrees at Oxford, right? So uh you pursued your PhD in neuroscience at Oxford?
Exactly. It was a combination of psychiatry and engineering.
Okay. So this is an interesting push because the path around PhDs oftentimes leads to academia. But a couple years later, you end up starting a company. Tell me a little bit about how that transition occurred, and I will bring you along to the topic that I focus on, and that's raising capital for startups. But tell me a little bit more about that transition. You were at Oxford, and then not too long after, a company came out of that.
Yeah, for sure. So honestly, the real reason I went to Oxford was not for yet another advanced degree in a prestigious university, but because I was in Harvard, which was an amazing environment where I could work with leading technologies all the time. And that's when I got interested in brain stimulation and realizing that pills like antidepressants are not working for the vast majority of people, not in the way they should. And yet mental health issues are increasing. So like we need to figure out something new as a scientific community. At the same time, I worked as an emergency medic, and this was Massachusetts during the height of the opiate crisis, where emergency medics would constantly see people with like addiction and struggle and kind of systems that didn't work for them. So I also wanted to make sure that the top science that we see in universities is very much translated into real world solutions and things like that. So I went to do my PhD really to pursue what I call translational neuroscience. So kind of neuroscience that is applied to making a difference in people's lives as well. So it wasn't just kind of a theoretical and academic pursuit, which a lot of people choose to do. For me, it was very much about like, great, we do have a lot of advancements. How do we make sure they change people's everyday lives and make me feel less helpless when I'm on the front lines as well with people who are struggling with everyday concerns that are now too far along to be helped along. So that's how I ended up in the PhD. And in the beginning, it was just enjoying it and going deeper into the field of brain stimulation and understanding what the potential would be. There, I focused on depression treatment with transcranial magnetic stimulation, which has been around as a treatment for a very long time, is FDA cleared, is EU cleared, and is kind of the perfect option for people for whom antidepressants don't work. And then as I was working in the space, I realized that a lot of the patients I was seeing in the depression space happened to be women. And if you ask them when depression started, they start mentioning, oh, it's always worse before my period, or oh, it started after I gave birth to my child, or I'm now nearing menopause and I'm starting to notice these depressive symptoms coming on. And then I realized and started looking through the literature and realized that no one is prescribed medication based on kind of where they are, especially in hormonally linked cycles for women. And yet it seems to be such a big predictor. And no one has studied it properly. No one has built solutions. And yet there's so many women suffering in silence. So that was the real impetus of like, what can I do about it? And as you said, venture-backed businesses were not at all on my radar. And so I just thought that this should be a fun research project. And then I'm so grateful for having met my co-founder who had previously built and exited a venture-backed business that was like, hey, like if we have a clear idea for a product here, we can let women show what matters to them and we can help support the early kind of R&D work with some of the grants and then help it escalate through a product that actually makes a difference to people's lives today without making it just an academic or an intellectual pursuit. Obviously, it
Yeah.
can be that alongside, but ultimately we do want the real difference to be there. And that's how it came under my radar. And that's when we co-founded Simfire.
Love it. In most situations or most stories, I might actually jump to the next step, which would be like, okay, you're thinking about raising capital. What were the things that came to mind? But you touched on something that I didn't actually see in the background that I want to pull apart a little bit because I'm fascinated by expertise. I'm fascinated by scientific expertise and the challenge to commercialize some of that work. Um, Oftentimes, I think people with expertise understand the problem space, but maybe are less connected to the business opportunity, the interest from the investor community. Tell me a little bit more about your co-founder and how you met your co-founder. Like under what pretense was that initial meeting? And I'd love to ask some follow-up questions because that's an interesting state that I'd love to encourage maybe more scientists to be exposed to.
Yeah, 100%. And that's kind of my biggest takeaway as well whenever I go back to university or connect with other academic or deep tech founders as well, is that you can see all the reasons why things wouldn't work. And you think progress is so far ahead that you can't even see the little delta as well. So me and my co-founder were very lucky circumstances. We were living in the same kind of dorm house. And so his past for background was that he was from Australia, originally born and raised there, and then studied law. And then kind of coming out of his legal work came an idea for a business. And it was essentially making crypto accessible for people. And this was before crypto was cool. We're talking like 2017. So this was very early kind of decentralized models and things like that. And then they exited that business in like 2019 or so. And then he was looking for a career switch on working on something that, again, made a difference to a lot of kind of people's lives. And he came to Oxford for studying finance and law. So very different skill set from mine, completely different background as well. And we happen to be in the same college. So the way that Oxford is organized is essentially a collegiate system. So everybody kind of lives in a separate college. And we literally got talking. And that was around the time when I was kind of noticing a lot of these symptoms and the fact that women shared them and that there was no solution. And that if we call something depression, that's serious. If we call something PMS, it's not serious. And yet at the brain level, it's the same thing. So surely there's something there. And then that's how we got talking that there could be an opportunity there. Initially, he's a man, grew up with three sisters, but didn't necessarily see what essentially his take was, which I think is a very fair take. Like, if this was a problem, surely this would have been solved already. Like, I can't believe that 90% of women experience PMS and would be dealing with it if it was so severe. So then we did an early prototype, just the two of us, and then ended up testing it in Oxford as well. And then essentially that's when he kind of got convinced that this was a big problem because he could see these women coming in and seeing this brain stimulation device that frankly looked like crap at the time. And essentially he was like, these women are so desperate for a solution and there's nothing out there for them. They can't take hormones or don't want to take hormones for whatever reason. And like they're trying to address both mood and pain symptoms. And this is something that could make a massive difference. And that's when we decided to kind of go all in into it. And the rest is history. And he's my husband and my co-founder still to this day.
Amazing. And I there's so many things to pull apart there, but as you were looking at the business, were you guys already romantically involved, or was this like, okay,
Yeah.
okay, that's actually not important to this, but just looking for context here. How do you think about the influence that sort of someone who came from the business world had on you? Like, if you are honest in your heart of hearts, how would you have scratched this itch, or how would you have pulled on this thread if you didn't have this maybe hard charging entrepreneur? I don't know, somebody who had done it
No.
before come to talk to you, because I think when I think about venture capital or finding funding, like I really think about the idea that there are so many world changing ideas trapped in people's minds. And some of the barrier is access to a little bit of funding. And so a lot of the conversation needs to be, well, how do we unlock this? How do we even who have this understanding to go after this stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And I'll give you the more nuanced question because I think that I agree with you that if we were to solve this problem, the world would be a better place because we could unlock so many new ideas. I think it's a combination of things. And I do think this is where the close relationship that me and my co-founder had makes such a difference. And in fact, if you look at a lot of deep tech founders with one technical founder, you'll find often than not that they were either family in some way or another or not. And as
Mhm.
I reflect upon it, and not that at all you should be, but I think scientists and people who have been in a technical space oftentimes communicate in a very weird way, where we go deep and deep and deep, and no one who is as technical understands even how cool that is. Like they need to spend extensive periods of time to even appreciate what the game changing thing could be. And usually that can take a while because then there's like a long offset or you go too deep or whatever. And so you need the quote unquote business person to kind of have the patience and the commitment to understand what the technical person is trying to say and then realize what the business case is from there. And I think that just requires a lot of kind of synergies and working together, patience, and kind of ongoing iteration of what is the real insight, how do we develop, and ongoing R&D is not a one-off thing. It's not just having an insight, it's like keep going with it. So I think that requires a lot of that close working together. So that's why in my experience, and again, I now know tons of deep tech founders since, but I think the partnerships where the quote unquote business person doesn't really understand the technology or is like the CTO does CTO things and I do CEO things doesn't really work is because you really need that partnership in order to truly understand where the value is unlocked. And that kind of partnership is really important. And I do think it's rare to find. So I do think like if you were just to hand out quote unquote business people to scientists, this wouldn't solve the problem. But finding those deeper connections, I think does take it to the next level in a very powerful way. Yeah, and I think have been lucky to do that. Would I have done it otherwise? Probably not in the same way, maybe over time as well. Definitely not as quickly as we had it done. But I also think that it's important to note that we just had technically such a different skill set and we're both technical in different ways. Like you could do a lot of like the legal finance and he had
Sure.
been a product manager in his previous company as well.
Yeah.
So in that sense, between ourselves, we kind of had the founding team already. And that also unlocks a lot of like prototyping that just the two of us could do.
This is fascinating, and it's a thread or a commonality that I hadn't picked up on before. But I interviewed Minna Song, who's the founder and co-founder and CEO of Elise AI.
Mhm.
She has a computer science degree from MIT,
Mm.
and she's deeply technical, and you can see it when you talk to her. And her co-founder is also her husband, who comes from a different world too. But it's interesting to bring out this point, which I think part of what you're saying is that in your case, this close relationship with your co-founder created an amount of trust, I think, that allowed him to like spend time with you, like spend time with it and understand the idea and not get bogged down by the technical details. Instead, like be able to rise above it and maybe talk to you a little bit about what is the vision here? What is the opportunity here? And how do we convince outsiders that this is something worth betting on?
Yeah.
Which kind of leads me to the topic that I want to focus on. So I would venture to guess that something that requires hardware, I think your approach is very hardware focused,
Mhm.
is not something that you think, "Mm, I think we're going to bootstrap this for a little bit of time. This feels like something that requires capital investment early on."
Yeah.
Um, Let me know if that's true or not. And then
It's
tell
true.
me a little, it is true. Okay. And tell me a little bit about how you thought about going to market with investors. Like what was the approach that you guys came together with of like, this is how much we're going to have to raise in order to even do our first version of the product? Do you remember that? What Emilė is about to share is one of those stories that reminds you that every founder, no matter how qualified, starts from zero when it comes to fundraising. When we get back, the story. There are a ton of easy mistakes founders make while growing a company. I've either made them all myself or watched them happen as an investor. One that keeps showing up, treating finance like a back office task instead of the central nervous system of the whole operation. I get why it happens. You're past the scrappy stage, but still feel too early for a full finance team. So you patch together spreadsheets, make decisions with partial data, and rely on gut to fill the gaps. Meanwhile, your competitors, especially in the AI era, aren't winging it. They're running on intelligent financial systems that give them clarity, foresight, and speed. My advice, don't wait. At least talk to someone who can show you what real financial clarity unlocks. Not just cleaner books, but the data and foresight that actually become competitive advantages. If you need a place to start, look at Propeller Industries. They're not the fractional CFOs who show up once a month. They embed into your team, your weekly rhythms, your forecasting cycles, your board prep. They've worked with more than 1,300 venture and growth stage companies, so they bring real pattern recognition plus the tools of an enterprise finance org. Set up a free call at propellerindustries.com and tell them we sent you. They're giving our audience a one-time $2,500 credit for new clients who stay for 3 months. Okay, back to the show.
Yeah, of course. It's one of those things where I remember it very well, but looking back, I'm like, it all seems clear. At the time, we didn't know much in the sense that, as you said, we had hardware at the core. Ultimately, we are a therapeutic treatment and we offer real solutions for women, which do require hardware and therefore do require R&D. In our case, it also required clinical trials. It required regulatory clearance and then everything that comes with making the product available as well. So we knew we needed capital early on. We didn't have a network because even though my co-founder had exited a company before, he was more in a product role. And at the time, and they hadn't never raised VC capital. So even though they had grown a lot, so they had done alternative ways of financing and had grown big, but not from VC. And so we didn't have any VC network or knowing what to do. And I still cringe looking at our decks. But we essentially did the best that we could, which is like we pulled our idea together. We pulled whatever kind of evidence we had so far, which was that test of women showing what they did, our prototype, and showing kind of the vision of where we could get it to. And then we literally both went through our LinkedIns and searched the word investor. And anyone who popped up, we were like, we're just going to reach out to them and see whether they're aligned.
Correct. Cold.
We didn't know anything. We spoke to people from private equity. We spoke to people who are like very random adjacent fields, like Series C fundraisers. And the thing is, people were amazing. Like we realized we spoke to maybe, I don't know, like maybe 100 people who kindly offered their time, literally just 5 minutes of their time. And they
this
would tell us,
again, reaching out cold, like
cold,
like LinkedIn.
cold
Okay,
outreach on LinkedIn, being
Yep.
like, hi, we came up with this business idea. And I think it was like COVID times because this was 2021. And I
Okay.
think at the time people were so willing to kind of put us in the right direction. So we had these calls, which like would have never been the right investor, but they gave us like a little bit pings in the right direction. So we kind of self-educated with these amazing people that offered their time a little bit in that direction. And then took
do
it
you
from there.
remember how much you were trying to raise in this very first little slug?
Yeah. So in this first kind of slot, we wanted 250K, ideally kind of as a safe, just because we didn't want to spend on legal costs. And my co-founder was a lawyer. So we're like, we don't want to touch that. So we wanted that. And that would have gotten us to a functional prototype that we could at least take through clinical trials and show people. Because the prototype we had was like, kind of like, if I assemble it on your head, it works, but otherwise it falls out.
Yeah, it's like a
So that's
node
what that
here.
was the aim at the time.
Feel it.
And also, I think it's worth noting the environment in late 2021, even though it was like peak deals and whatever, all of that,
Yeah,
we were doing hardware regulated neurotechnology for women's health. And
yeah.
I thought that the crazy thing would be hardware regulated neurotechnology. The crazy part was instead women's health. And I
Mhm.
think I didn't appreciate that. And in that sense, actually having a man as a co-founder was very helpful because we could test a lot of the for someone who doesn't experience this, how do you make them understand that 50% of the population might, or like, how do you talk about something without making it feel alienating, making it feel like professional, technical, and everything? And at the time, women's health wasn't where it is now. Like now it's so much more of like a public conversation topic. And I thought that I would need to spend a lot more time explaining neurotechnology, but instead I spent a lot more time explaining kind of the women's health market, the lack of options, and the amount of opportunity.
Yeah. Okay. So you actually announced a round in June, which is larger than that little $250,000 slug. This is a fascinating conversation, and I could spend hours on this, but I do want to kind of accelerate. It sounds like you were able to raise at least a small stub of money to get past that first phase. Did it end up being 250,000 somewhere
It
around
ended
there?
up being a little bit more than that because we ended
Wow.
up bringing kind of 2 funds
Okay.
at the time.
Amazing. Okay. So you got some money in the door.
Yeah.
And then if you announced in June of this year, that probably means you closed somewhere early in the year. That's my guess. And if I were to work backwards from that, that means you you had done about 2 years of work. So you went out to fundraise end of 2024. You had done 2 years of work, which means you had a prototype. And by the way, this is me just inferring.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you
So
correct.
how about I give you the timeline?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So we started work late in 2021, and then we had a couple of kind of safes along the way. And we formally closed our first round, which was our pre-seed, which was 2.3 million in 2023. So
Ah,
between 2021 and 2023, we essentially did exactly what you said. We did R&D. So we built the product that we wanted. We took it through clinical trials. So we were able to clinically validate our technology. We built up our manufacturing and supply chain. By the way, we've made a lot of decisions and happy to elaborate on those, but we keep our hardware, software engineering, firmware engineering, supply chain management, and clinical work all in-house. So we do it all ourselves. And that's because we want to have high control. No one has done what we've done before. And so we want to make sure we're very close to our users and delivering on that. But yeah, it meant we needed to set up our supply chains and our manufacturing and things like that, as well as going through regulatory clearances in Europe and the UK. So we got our
wow.
device.
All of that
We're about to
on
get
2
there.
and a half all of that on about $2.5 million
Yeah.
is quite impressive. Okay, so that timeline really helps, which
Yeah.
means what I'd be interested in knowing, because we like to focus on the most recent fundraise.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about right around when you were like, "Okay, we're ready to go raise our next round."
Yeah.
Do you remember what the thought process was? Was it, "We just hit an inflection point"? Was it looking at your runway? What was going through your head, and what was the story that you were gonna go out to market with?
Yeah. So that actually comes back to something we were talking about earlier, which is technical founders, and where I think a lot of technical founders fall short is that we had done all of this work way above with much less capital than people normally do to show
Yeah.
that our product works, it's amazing, and it outcompetes everyone else. And we had just gotten our clearances in June 2024, showing that we can sell the product. What we didn't realize is that market entry and marketing costs and kind of just market access costs are a whole nother category on top of hardware. We were kind of like, once we've built amazing hardware, we've shown amazing clinical data, surely we just give it to people. And that wasn't the case. I mean, we knew there was traction and we were educating our audience all along. We weren't naive, as I describe it. But, it was, we opened pre-sales and pre-sales sold out within a day. And we're
Right.
like, shit, like we can't scale our manufacturing at the moment. We need to invest a lot of like, again, capital equipment expenses again. Then we need to do market access expenses. And that's when in June 2024, we got that realization and we realized that, we now sold out a batch. We kind of were able to replenish it and then we sold out again. And then we realized we needed to make it more systemic. And for that, we needed more capital. So I went out to fundraise again in late 2024. And then we ended up closing our 5 million seed to support that next phase of growth towards the end of that year.
That's amazing. So a lot of the things that you mentioned, by the way, congrats on all the progress and the types of challenges you were running into are the types of challenges that I think investors would love to hear. It's like, oh, you keep selling out. You don't have enough capital to,
They feel
sustain.
much harder as the founder needing to go through them, but I hope it makes for a
Totally.
good story.
No, no, no. I completely understand that. I'm actually going to take the flip side of this, which is like, yes, these are all super positive things. Like
Yeah.
we have all this clinical data. We created our first capabilities to manufacture in-house. We've been doing these launches and selling out. Demand is there. We can't keep up with supply. That's what we need funding for. But I think the reality that we like to expose within Funded and the stories that we tell is that it's like, it's not all, it's not all like cakewalks in terms of raising capital.
Glamorous.
There are challenges when you go out there. And
Yeah.
and one of the questions that I love asking is, with all that positivity, right? Harvard undergrad, Oxford PhD, clinical trials, like selling out demand, you're always raising on this edge of like not uncertainty, right? You're pricing it at a certain level where there's going to be doubt. Where do you think what do you remember as being the biggest doubts that investors came up with? Like, what were the things that you needed to convince people of, even with all that stuff backing you as you went out to raise this $5 million round?
Yeah. So I think there were things that we could have changed since and things we can't. So things within our control and beyond it. I think things beyond our control that frankly made the decision for, I would say, 99% of investors is the fact that, as I said, in 2021, women's health wasn't even a field. And now I'm saying I'm going to build this massive company in the space because no one else has. And frankly, they should have. And I don't know why they haven't, or we can go into the reasons why I think they haven't, but it is definitely a new category. And so there's very few success stories to point to. And I
Yeah.
think most investors like pattern matching and being able to be like, one, I've seen this company out there, or even better, I have invested in a similar company with similar market dynamics, similar business models, and things like that. And they like to pattern match. For us, it was very hard to pattern match. There wasn't a lot of similar comparable products, and certainly none in our category, in our vertical. There were relatively few companies that have as much control as we do in terms of like, oh, usually you have the hardware engineers, but then you wouldn't have software, whereas we do everything and have a lot of that control. So that was important as well. So one, no really good precedent of massive companies in our space. Two is there was a little bit of regulatory burden. Like we kind of do both regulated as well as wellness products now. But a big part of our story is that we do always want to be the top product in our category so that we could be reimbursed, so that we could be kind of scalable across healthcare systems as well. And that's a big barrier for a lot of investors because they don't want to take on regulatory risk because it's beyond your control in some ways, independent.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of these types of things. And I would say, again, as I said, 99% of people I think would fall short on those. On the 1% that we could control, people would have loved to see kind of that we have kind of product market fit in terms of being able to service demand. And I
Yeah.
think while we had shown a lot of excitement about these like drops of launches accidentally, we couldn't sustain without additional capital servicing ongoing demand. And so that was definitely a struggle where some of the people fell short and luckily have resolved that. And then two is we are very excited about launching in the US as well, which again needed additional capital. And at the time we could only support a EU UK launch. And for a lot of our American investors, that potentially was a barrier as well, just because they obviously would have loved to see the product in their geography and tested for demand in their geography.
Yeah.
And without additional batches and having enough capital to launch in a new market, we couldn't do that. And now we've done that as well.
Nice. Okay. So I've heard this a lot with sort of startups that focus on the female market, which has been hard to convince people of. Obviously, people talk about 90% of investors are men, and so hard to envision that market, putting yourself in the seat of the consumer, but it is 50% of the world.
I will say, I do want to, I don't know what other stories necessarily you hear about that. I think men as investors are quite rational in the sense of like, they might not relate to the problem, but they will always look at the numbers.
Yeah.
I think I found that the numbers are so limited. Like I can't, and I'm a numbers person. I'm literally like a
Yeah.
STEM person, and finding data on PMS is pretty much impossible. And so the thing is, like, I know that if we had the facts, people would look at them. And that's actually the fundamental difference that we have now that we didn't have before. We now have our own collected data on what those symptoms are, how they look like, how we can use them. And I think it's much easier to talk when you have that data. And when you're in a space with very little data, it's a she said kind of thing where it's like
Okay.
everybody's guessing.
So this is a great, I appreciate you calling out that I might be a rational investor. But I think that the question or the story that I want to bridge to is talking a little bit about your relationship with Inventures,
Mhm.
the lead of this last round, and more so your sort of articulation of why you were able to get them over that challenge or that what did you do to allow them to dream alongside of you? What was the relationship like that maybe gave them a little bit more trust in you? Can we talk a little bit about how that came to be and where you thought getting them over the hump actually occurred?
100%. I think what's helpful context here is we were incredibly lucky, and I will never take it for granted, but we had a very oversubscribed round and needed to say no to a couple of alternative leads. And so when Inventure came along, maybe what's worth talking about is like why we felt that that was the right fit long term as well. And in terms of the story and the commitment that we convince people with, it's kind of like, look, we have all this data that we showed you, and we were able to show that with relatively little capital to other companies. Now, to get to this next stage, we need capital, but we also need the right partners to help us launch in two different markets, to help us scale up a lot of our operations and really be with us in the trenches. We really didn't want investors who didn't have operating experience. For us at the stage, we felt like that was really important because a lot of the challenges we were running into were not yet strategic, they were primarily operational. And
Mhm.
we felt that that was the big unlock. So we wanted people with operating experience. That was one. Two is we wanted people for whom we would be an important investment. And we felt that a lot with bigger kind of funds at the time. We felt that we could fall in the back. And in our first pre-seed, we had about 6 funds. And we know that when funds are stretched thin, it's amazing because frankly, we don't need a lot of support. But when we do want support, we want that call to be picked up very
Yeah.
soon. And so that was really important for us. And what Inventure did, which is
Can you take a step back and actually say when did you meet and venture the fund relative to when you started raising this round?
yeah, so we had actually already signed a term sheets for this round when we met in venture. And one of the
First time
inventors,
meeting them.
well, no. So we had signed with someone else. And then as the lead, like one of the participants, and then we
Sure.
were kind of bringing in the rest of the people along. And then it was actually really interesting because one of the inventors partners kept pinging me on LinkedIn, but I kind of felt that the round was settled. It was already quite competitive and we just needed to close it. But we were undergoing a Delaware flip at the time, which was taking a while. So the round was taking longer than expected to close. And so we were just taking our time with the docs. And then essentially the partner from Inventure kept pinging me on LinkedIn. And finally I was like, great, let's take this call, even though we're not fundraising anymore. And we just clicked right away. They kind of got what we were about. They were so committed. And then we obviously told them the round is closed. The deal's pretty much done. And they're like, well, is it signed, sealed, delivered? And we're like, well, ish signed, but everything else is in the air. And they're like, well, how about we fly to see you tomorrow? We want to spend, if you can give us half a day of your time and half a day of your co-founder's time, and we go deep through the docs all together. You send us all the other DD information. We will go through it. We will get all our partners on it. We'll get everyone involved. And we're really committed to making this happen. And they did. And honestly, that was the time where we were like, obviously, this would be potentially disruptive to a round, but I think this speaks to their commitment. And honestly, like to anyone, I wish such investors upon them who like just showed that they were so committed to the mission so that I knew that if things weren't going to plan, at least they're going to be with us there in the trenches and help us figure out. And that's why ultimately we needed to make some very hard decisions. But I do think it created this type of partnership between us and Adventure that it will take us a very far way. And I have been very supported since. Like they have been consistent with that behavior ever since as well. And I've heard founders blindsided by kind of wine and dining up front and then being weird, but they
Yeah.
but they didn't do that. They literally came in, they were interested in the business, they challenged us, they pushed us, and I knew that they would continue doing that if they were to join. So, yeah,
And so when they reached out, you had never met them before.
never. And it was
Amazing.
a cold LinkedIn outreach, and they actually had not heard of us about us before, is my understanding. They
Well, how
also
did they even think to reach
I
out
think
to you?
they saw us because I was posting a little bit on LinkedIn, and I think they literally just saw something about our thing and was like, "Oh, this is weird enough." And they were aware of our technology. So we are only one of three approved neurotechnology devices in the EU. And so I think they had spoken to the two others, and I think they may have missed that as an opportunity, but we had never had a direct contact with them. We're not introed in any way. So that was a full cold outreach, which is actually kind of weird.
That's amazing. And did they end up like co-leading the round, or how did you
Yeah,
do that?
exactly. So they co-led it with Fortify Ventures, which is a New York-based fund.
That is so cool. There's going to be, I do like a debrief around this. And part of this actually will be instructional for venture capitalists because like,
Yeah.
man, if you like a deal, that's what you have to do. You
Honestly,
really
and
have
it
to. Yeah.
made such a difference, and
Yeah.
especially in our space where it was a hardware deal and everything, and they didn't shy away from the complexity. They were open around things that they know, things they don't know. And they did bring in experts to review some of our materials. Like they still took a little bit more time on the
Sure.
DD, but it was more like they had context about everything. They spent that deep time. So highly recommended. Please do put it in.
Um, and what was the lead partner's name there?
So the main one was Kevin Losh,
Okay.
and then now we have Magda Lukashevich as well. So yeah, a female
Amazing.
on board.
Sounds like a very good team, which I might pull apart and dive into a little bit later.
Yeah.
Uh, and there's again, we talk about all the credibility you had going into it, all the great things. You had an oversubscribed round. You had a lead that literally had to like barge into your LinkedIn's in order to even take part
I'm
of the
so glad
deal.
they did.
But 99% of company firms are not going to like what you're doing because of pattern recognition, because of hardware, regulation, et cetera. Do you remember any of the hardest times of even thinking about raising this round? Are there situations that went through this that like still like you remember the painful feelings around that you could share?
Yeah, of course. Everything about raising around is very painful. I remember I think when I was describing that June moment where we just got clearance and then I realized that, shoot, like to do what we want to do, we'd be running out of, like, we had still money to have some runway, but we realized that that runway was literally to survive, not to do what we wanted to. And it felt like you're under delivering on that mission. And I think as a founder CEO, it's a unique feeling of like, I started this, I now have people working on this, we have all this vision and mission, and now like I need to convince someone else to actually make it a reality as well. And
Right.
we're just like one step away from proving out the next thing, which was like in our case. So I think before you start the fundraise, it's kind of that reality hits you moment that can be very terrifying. And then frankly, all of the fundraising process is always brutal for everyone, even when it goes well, because it's an assessment, and it is an assessment of you. It is an assessment of your idea. It is an assessment of your team. To me, maybe just the way that I work, I don't think I actually take a lot of these things personally, but I do take things personally on my team. And so like in the sense that like people who build this and thought very carefully. And I felt, for example, on investor calls, we would get questions about the technology. And then if you try to explain it, like they kind of care about the superficial decisions, but not the deep ones. And I often felt like I'm not doing my team justice by explaining all of the kind of considerations that they had in the meantime. It's obviously not the purpose of an investor
Sure.
call, but it just felt like there were a lot of things that I needed to simplify and maybe not show the amazing work that had come in there. But I will say the most helpful thing that I did this round, which I hadn't done before, which made a massive difference, was that I counted the no's, not the yes. So essentially, like, I think so many founders get so demotivated because they're waiting for that one or a couple of yeses from the right aligned investor. And I think going into this round, what was helpful is that by that point, I had been in the women's health technology space for 3 years. And I knew most people don't want to invest in women's health for potentially good reasons, but mostly they don't have their theses around it or technology or regulated products or whatever. So I knew the vast majority of investors are not right for us. So I set myself a goal that I'll fundraise very intensively until I get 50 no's. And what counts as a no for me is if someone opened my email, I use Superhuman so I could see that people were opening it. If someone opened my deck and then after reviewing the deck, so spending more than 5 seconds on it, sent me an email saying no. So it's a pretty high threshold because most VCs ignore you, don't open your email, don't open your
Yeah.
deck, whatever. So I'm like, as long as I keep myself to that, let's do 50 of those and then take it from there. And then we got our first yes, I think at the 17th no or something like that. So it was a huge success, I would say.
Your success.
But it also completely just changed my perspective because
Yeah.
it meant that every no I got pushed me forward. And I knew that I was moving forward as well because every no gives you a little bit of feedback, a little bit of indication. You remember the call, you remember what they were asking about. And so I think it trained me to be, frankly, a better founder because even if the feedback was not the reason why they said yes or no, they gave me good perspectives that I could then see a little bit more clearly because I was waiting for the no, not for the yes. And when you're waiting for the yes, then you kind of discard everyone who said the
Yeah.
no. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, for every founder, I just found that mentally much more easily resilient, but also I took so much away from the fundraising process that I think made me a much better CEO and for this next scaling part of the journey as well.
I really love that tip, something that I will share with more founders. It's subtly different from what other people say, which is like what you'll hear a lot of people say is every no is just one step closer to the yes.
Yeah.
But I think
It's not
defining an amount of
quantified.
yeah, exactly. So if you quantify it and give yourself an expectation, a lot of people will talk about a human's ability to withstand discomfort or pain, and where it's actually possible or doable or something that a human can do without much consternation is when they understand how long they're gonna go. If
Yeah.
you say if you're gonna fast for 3 days,
Yeah.
you know exactly when when you'll count it
Beginning
as
time
being
and stop
complete,
time.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas if we just say, "Let's stop eating," and I'll tell you when you're gonna stop eating,
Yeah.
you're gonna start
Well,
eating,
it's
it'll feel
also
very uncomfortable.
It's also more conceptual because I was like, okay, if I have had 50 people who specialize in making investments in the space,
Right?
review our deck, spend some time reflecting, and they think there's a problem with it, so, or they're not convinced in it, then we probably need to go back to the books and like kind of really, really reconsider. I also think it's good to like think about it as a stepwise process because I do meet a lot of founders who've been fundraising for a very long time, sometimes with great companies, sometimes with not so great companies. Obviously, there's always a range. But I think you don't have an inbuilt way of reflecting of like, when have I gotten enough no's to treat that as a signal that I need to rethink this? Or when is it just like random distribution that not every investor is yours? And I think at 50, you can pretty much be like, at this point, I'm getting some signal from the market. Before that, it could be, I just haven't spoken to enough people.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Radytė, yeah. This has been an illuminating conversation. Very cool to see what you're going through, and I love seeing the progress of like we're in neuroscience and hardware and women's health, and all three of those categories feel hard to fund. And as you've gone through this journey, the dominoes start falling, or things start falling in your favor. And I've recently heard Tim Ferriss talk a lot about the advances in neurostimulation as being the next wave of mental health
I've been
treat.
cleared it last week.
Yeah, so it's really incredible. We'll love to keep in touch as you go into the next phase, but this has been an amazing conversation. So really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. And thanks for asking the questions that kind of go beyond the superficial as well. Really appreciated it.
That was my interview with Dr. Emilė Radytė, co-founder and CEO of Samphire Neuro, a regulated neurotechnology company building solutions for the hormonal symptoms that have gone overlooked and underfunded for far too long. In their interview, you probably heard how surprised I was at how their lead investor got in touch with them, cold, over LinkedIn. I was shocked. So shocked that I had to reach out to the investor in question to hear more about his approach to finding great deals. Check this out. Kevin, you're one of the investors in Samphire Neuro. I spoke with your founder, Dr. Emilė Radytė, and she said some things that were pretty interesting in terms of how you even got involved in the deal. And that's why I've decided to have a separate conversation with you. Before I ask you those specific questions or even tell you how she painted the picture of your involvement, I wonder if you could spend just 30 seconds describing your firm and venture.
No, of course. I mean, Adventure is a pretty much straightforward early stage fund based out of Helsinki and Stockholm. We just celebrated the 20 years anniversary beginning of the
Wow.
year. We're investing from the fourth fund, pretty much 150 million euros fund. We invest up to 4 million initially. But I think the interesting part of us is we are purely Nordic and Baltic focused, not necessarily just geography wise, but also vortex wise. So basically, SM is Lithuanian, but sits in London and now moves over to the States. We kind of like track vortexes around the world basically, and simply believing that the ecosystem around the Nordics and Baltics kind of like is a very fertile ground to not only build companies, but also build great builders ultimately who move around the world afterwards. Bit on us. Otherwise, we have done a bit the shift from the first fund, which was pretty much a deep tech focused fund, to a pretty generalistic fund ultimately, which we are in fund four. What else can I say? I think what is pretty interesting with us, we are a very nimble and small team. And while a lot of funds have a pretty much focus on certain sectors or subsectors, ultimately, we are very much focused on founders and kind of like where do we find the raw diamonds ultimately, which we can basically bring up to the surface. And that's also when you look at our portfolio, it's not pretty straight line as you wouldn't expect in early stage because there's a lot of I would say OG VC non-scalable businesses in, and we have
Hmm.
backed a quantum computing company, we have backed a satellite company, we have obviously backed the consumer hardware company, which is maybe not the most scalable VC cases as most of them will look, but we strongly believe that those businesses are built by very contrarian founders, and that's usually our thesis why we invest early stage, and like that's also why we don't shy away of going to, let's say, industries which are maybe not consensus now but will become consensus over a time frame of 18 or 24 months, because that's a bit like our playground where we feel most comfortable in,
Hmm.
and not necessarily chasing like where majority of the funds ultimately currently going, and like say, hey, there's a lot of AI application companies, that's what we kind of like navigate our focus into, right? It's not like we don't want to back those companies, we would love to, but ultimately we also need to understand what's our playing ground and where do we have kind of like a right to win, so to speak. And currently in the Nordics and the Baltics right now, there's a lot of money influx in those kind of like areas, and it's simply hard for us over time to win in those categories. So that's why we kind of like focus pretty much on like where are the more contrarian founders, but kind of like with a strong thesis that they kind of like build something which becomes consensus over a time frame of 24
Yeah.
months.
Love it. Love it. Focus on contrarian approaches and the talent arbitrage and sort of Nordics and the Baltics. Okay. So that's a great backdrop for your involvement in Samfire Neuro. Let me tell you what I heard from M, which I thought was fascinating. So we went through the story of her fundraising and capitalizing the company, and there was a fun evolution of her own sophistication around fundraising, starting from we were just reaching out to people cold on LinkedIn to then like really sort of building heat around what she's doing today. The thing that really caught my eye was she said that in this last round, she had already a signed term sheet or something close to that with a lead fund when this firm Inventure came out of nowhere and reached out to her. And not only reached out to her, but reached out to her cold on LinkedIn and then found out that there was already a deal in place and wouldn't let it go. And like sort of forced their way into at least having a conversation, which ultimately led to having co-leads in the deal. And so I was like, "Oh my gosh, do you think your investor would tell me a little bit about this?" Because I think this is instructive both for emerging managers, people who are trying to drive strategy around finding great deals, but also just like the psychology of investors and when they get excited so that founders understand what they should be doing. So I wonder if you could, if we take a couple steps back, if you could tell me how Samfire, how M's company even got on your radar.
Right.
Where did you first hear about it? What caught your eye?
Right. I remember the process. I think it was like one of the most exciting processes because it was like everything was so fast ultimately. And so I'm not sure how much you know about the Nordic ecosystem, but we have an event which is called Slush, which is usually
Mostly
like
gaming related.
no. It's kind of like right now. I think must be one of the largest tech conferences globally, even, and it's happening usually end of November, beginning of December for 3 days. Usually, this whole week is basically where almost the whole ecosystem stands still in this in Helsinki. And I remember this process. So how we got, or how M got on our radar was basically one colleague from another firm basically nudged my colleague Adrian. And even though Adrian is not necessarily our healthcare and bio investor, which is usually my my pet peeve ultimately, he took a first call with M, and basically immediately after the call said, "Hey, we should jump on this call immediately, and kind of I want to get your insight on it because I've spent a lot of time previously looking into the femcare market quite significantly and was looking for a solution which is not only kind of like a data layer, but certain form of integrated care delivery, which is Samfire ultimately doing with their product." Then we had the call with M, and you look usually in founders for there's this kind of like phrase I use, and I think it was originated by the Collison brothers at Stripe. It's the called exothermic, looking for founders which bring more energy than they actually drag, or generally people who give more energy into a room that they actually take on. And after 5 minutes talking with M, it was fairly clear her energy, her brute force, her high raw intelligence is something which we haven't had seen for a very long period of time. And I remember it was not so much for us about the conviction on the market or the product at this time. It was for us becoming more the question of we need to back her no matter what. And she was very transparent in the call, and she was even addressing it, if I'm not completely wrong here, that, hey, let's have this call. The round is subscribed, but you guys also do seed rounds, because it was in between our pre-seed and seed size-wise. So we can check in then in 6 or 9 months once we have the progress, so we can start the relationship. And the more we talk with M, the more it was quite clear that she is one of those personas. She's very mission driven. She's very obsessed with this problem. And she is kind of like a persona. When you get to her background and understand how she grew up, where did she come from, what did she experience in her life, you will and you draw the line between what she is building, you know exactly that she will make it her life's mission to bring this course, to bring the awareness about PMS, PMDD, and generally female healthcare out there, and is going to be one of the global leaders in this field no matter what. And with her energy levels in this particular call, it was for us a no-brainer to basically leave the call and Adrian and I debriefing how can we fight ourselves into this deal. And if you're convicted, I think it's a very naive thing as an investor to say, hey, the round is oversubscribed, we can't get into, right? Because I think VCs need to act up on signals and proxies. That's what the whole industry is ultimately based on, not on hard and truth facts and precedent seed, right? And if you have a founder who is basically signaling you all of the above, then you need to make a zero life decision to ultimately get into those rounds. So I think what we have done afterwards was 3 or 4 days later, we were flying immediately to London, right? And sitting there with M. And I think one of our core parts of the process is ultimately that we sit down with the founders and talk about their lives. And I think trying to, in this kind of like particular 1 hour with each founder, to form a bond which helps them also understand us better. Because we believe strongly in that you can supercharge relationships in a certain way, but this means you need to understand the person on the other side of the table very, 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 very strongly, also from how they grew up and where they want to go into life, what drives them, what motivates them. That basically this conversation, I think, was changing M's opinion significantly of kind of, hey, I understand those guys very well. They understand me very well. I think we should do this together here. And
So
then
at this point, you had to convince her essentially to fight for you to be in the round almost. Term sheets are not legally binding, so you can back out anyways, but there is a norm and there are a set of expectations around how this is done. And so she would have had to go to bat for you with her existing lead and say, hey, there's another firm in here and we'd like to cut you back in order to let them in. So tell me about that. Had you worked with this other firm before? So did you have an existing relationship? Was it sharp elbows? How did it work?
No, I think we usually don't tend to kind of try to disrupt any relationships, also from a founder's perspective, because M was quite clear on that she likes this fund. And we respect that a lot. And there's a couple of mechanisms you can always pull, right? You can increase the round size, you can play around the valuation a bit, and you can also try to make understand. We can also cut back from our side on the ownership targets. And it was basically a mixture of all the above. We gave the whole round size increased a bit. We took then the co-lead ultimately, and there was some smaller angels which were cut back ultimately. But the positive aspect was there was one investor on the cap table, which is a small Lithuanian pre-seed fund called First Pick, which whom we have basically worked in the past very, very much. And they had a lot of, they were a good reference for us to M. So M backchanneled also how we usually operate. And given that one of the investors is in the US, it was also then for M, I believe, quite logical to have a European fund on the cap table, which is basically enabling them also, if something goes wrong, we are very close to them. So basically we can have the FaceTime ultimately. And this was kind of like one of the another selling factors where M was, maybe it makes sense to increase the round size a bit if you guys cut down on your ownership targets to make this round come together ultimately. So it was basically leveraging all of the mechanics you ultimately have as an early stage fund.
Okay, so now that we've heard from Emilė and her lead investor, there are a few things to pull apart in the debrief when we come back. The founders I see that do best in company building and fundraising have a secret weapon. Their secret weapon is a community of people, of experts, of peers in the startup industry that they can ask for help from at any time, guide them through processes like fundraising. I wanted to make that easier for everyone else to have access to by building the Adamant fundraising program and community. This gives you access to 75 different training videos around the fundraising process to give you that expert starting point around how to actually execute fundraising, and then access to a community where we host live pitch deck teardowns and office hours every week to make sure that you can ask the minute questions on how your deck should be better, how you should reform your strategy, how you should answer investors who are reaching out to you that you don't know how to answer. So if you want to check that out, if you want to get the secret weapon that I think a lot of the best founders have, check out adamantfundraising.com and join us today. All right, so now that we've gotten a chance to review what Emilė said, what Kevin said, I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to keep this debrief short because we've extended this interview and this episode with multiple segments. But there were a couple of things that I thought were really important around highlighting, underlining, etc. And the biggest one was that lesson that Emilė had around the number of no's that she would have to go through before she started feeling like she actually got to a significant sample size of feedback from investors. Like I said in the interview, so many people have this sort of generic advice of like, every no is just one step closer to the yes. But that sort of mindset feels very painful. It's like you're wandering the desert and you have no idea when water is going to come. It can be very hard to stay committed, stay positive, and stay pushing when you don't know when the end of the pain is in sight, like when it's going to actually happen. I really loved flipping that and saying, look, we won't start getting upset, or we won't start getting nervous, or we won't call it significant sample size until we get 50 no's. And so the no's are just an understanding of when we're going to get to a stopping point, when we know we need to change direction, when we know we need to refocus back on the company and nothing else. I love that. And the thing that I wanted to pull away from this and encourage founders who are fundraising to adopt that sort of approach is, again, no's don't really mean that you're running a bad business. No's don't mean that you're running a bad investment opportunity. No's don't mean you're a bad founder. The only thing we can tell with one simple no, an isolated no, is that it wasn't a deal for that investor. And there are so many reasons why good deals are not good fits for certain investors. Also, on the flip side, the things that make a deal exciting to some investors, you would be shocked at what those reasons are, like why they started getting interested in a space, why they have some deeper insight or deeper connection to the thing that you're doing that you couldn't have you couldn't have figured out, or you couldn't have understood before you went in to talk to them. And so because of that randomness that is associated with fundraising and investor interest, you have to have a big target set for your fundraising outreach. You have to be ready and willing to talk to a bunch of people, kiss a lot of frogs until you get to that one great fit. Now, on the other side, I had to talk to Kevin because, gosh, I thought it was so interesting and exciting that a lead investor would be so aggressive to find an opportunity and reach out over LinkedIn cold and really push to fight for a deal that seemingly was kind of already closing, if not closed. A couple things here. I know a lot of VCs listen to this podcast. And so I think that's just a great reminder that if you're a VC, you are in a competitive market. There aren't tons of great deals out there. And so if you see a great deal, you've got to be aggressive. You have to go after that. And you have to have the conviction to drive yourself to be aggressive around deals that you really like. And if you don't think you can win deals, if you don't think that you can fight your way into deals and convince founders that you're a great investor for their cap table, then you kind of shouldn't be in this game anyways, because the only deals you're going to get into are the scraps, the leftovers, the ones that everyone passes on. So I love that. And then the other takeaway from this that I think founders can draw from is, I just think surface area is important. Surface area for luck to smile on you, surface area for people to discover you. So whatever that means, and however you can balance it with the core time spent building a great company, I would just encourage you to always look for places and spaces where you can set aside more surface area for great investors, great talent, great partners, great clients to discover you around. All right. Hope that was helpful. I hope you enjoyed hearing both sides of that story. And that's the debrief. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions about today's show, or maybe you're raising capital yourself and want help problem solving, you can find me on social. I'm at JAYEH, that's JAYYEH, on almost any social platform. And you can email me at jason@fundedpod.com. I also have a newsletter where I share tips, strategies, tactics around fundraising. You can find that and all the other ways that I support founders in their work to fundraise more effectively and efficiently at my website. That's admnt.com, short for adamant. You can find me there and figure out if there's anything that I can help you with.